Imagine a world where a global superpower is systematically turned into a nation of addicts, not by a criminal cartel, but by another sovereign empire. Imagine your ports being seized, your treasures looted, and your people poisoned for the sake of a trade deficit. This isn't a dystopian fiction. It was the cold, hard reality for China in the 19th century. For thousands of years, China viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, the literal center of the universe, possessing wealth and culture that made the rest of the world look primitive. But then came the Opium Wars. A period so dark and so devastating that it is still etched into the soul of every Chinese citizen today as the century of humiliation. Britain didn't just want tea. They wanted to break the back of an empire that refused to bow. They flooded the streets with opium, turning millions of productive citizens into hollow shells of themselves. It was a calculated, brutal dismantling of a civilization. But history is a long game. Today, the dragon hasn't just woken up. It has returned with a vengeance, fueled by a collective memory of pain and a vow that the world will never, ever treat them that way again. How did a nation that was once carved up like a birthday cake by foreign powers transform into a technological and economic titan that now makes the West tremble? This is the story of the greatest comeback in human history, the revenge of the dragon. To understand the fire that drives modern China, we have to go back to the early 1800s, when the Qing dynasty was at its peak of arrogance. The emperor lived in the Forbidden City, convinced that China had everything it could ever need. They were the world's factory even then, producing silk, porcelain, and tea that the British aristocracy couldn't live without. But there was a problem. The British were spending all their silver on Chinese tea, and the Chinese wanted nothing from the British in return. No wool, no gadgets, nothing. To fix this trade imbalance, the British East India Company turned to a more sinister commodity: opium, grown in India and smuggled into China. This drug spread like a virus. It didn't just drain China of its silver. It drained the nation of its lifeblood. Farmers left their plows, soldiers dropped their swords, and the very fabric of Chinese society began to rot from within. When the Chinese government finally tried to push back by destroying thousands of tons of British opium, Britain didn't apologize. They sent warships. This was the moment the world shifted. The First Opium War proved that ancient walls and traditional courage were no match for industrial steamships and modern cannons. The resulting Treaty of Nanking was a stab in the heart, forcing China to pay for the very war that defeated them and to give up Hong Kong. This wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological collapse that signaled the beginning of a century where China would be bullied, exploited, and ignored. As the 19th century dragged on, the wounds only grew deeper. The Second Opium War saw the British and French marched right into Beijing, where they committed an act of cultural terrorism that China has never forgotten: the burning of the old Summer Palace. This wasn't just a building. It was a garden of gardens, a masterpiece of architecture and art that represented 500 years of history. It took 3,500 soldiers to loot it, and 3 days for it to burn to the ground. The smoke could be seen from the Forbidden City, a constant reminder that the emperor was powerless. Following this, the world saw China as a dying animal, and the vultures began to circle. Russia, Japan, Germany, and France all moved in, carving out spheres of influence where Chinese law did unapply, and no dogs or Chinese allowed signs hung in their own parks. The final blow came not from the West, but from the East. Japan's brutal invasion in the 1930s, including the horrific rape of Nanking, brought a level of suffering that is almost impossible to comprehend. Millions died. And the nation was a fractured, starving shell of its former self. But in the fires of this absolute despair, something new was being forged. The disparate people of China, who had been divided by warlords in civil war, began to find a common purpose. They weren't just fighting for land anymore. They were fighting for the right to exist without shame. When Mao Zedong stood at the gates of the Forbidden City in 1949 and declared that the Chinese people had stood up, it was a signal to the world that the era of being a victim was over. However, the road to superpower status was paved with radical and often disastrous experiments. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were periods of immense internal pain, showing that even after foreign invaders were gone, the struggle to rebuild a broken identity was a monumental task. But the turning point came with a quiet, pragmatic leader named Deng. He realized that, for the dragon to truly seek revenge and regain its status, it didn't need just ideology. It needed an economy that could rival the world. In the late 1970s, China opened its doors to the world on its own terms. They became the world's factory, starting with cheap toys and textiles, but always with an eye on the future. They weren't just making products. They were absorbing technology, learning Western systems, and building a massive chest of foreign reserves. This was the silent phase of the comeback. While the West enjoyed cheap goods, China was building the largest high-speed rail network on Earth, modernizing its military, and lifting 800 million people out of poverty in a single generation of feat, never before seen in the history of our species. The true revenge of the dragon, however, isn't just about money. It's about a total shift in the global balance of power. Today, China is no longer content being the world's assembly line. They want to be the world's laboratory. They are leading the race in 5G technology, artificial intelligence, and green energy. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a modern version of the old Silk Road. But this time, the infrastructure leads back to Beijing, creating a web of influence that spans across Asia, Africa, and Europe. This is geopolitical chess played at the highest level. When China builds military bases in the South China Sea or takes a hard line on Taiwan, it is on just about territory, about ensuring that no foreign navy can ever again blockade their coast or dictate their destiny. The memory of those British warships in 1840 is the ghost that haunts the Chinese Politburo. Their aggressive stance today is a direct response to their vulnerability yesterday. They have replaced the Sick Man of Asia label with a national rejuvenation project that aims to restore China to the position it held for centuries before the Opium Wars. The preeminent power on the planet, this transformation has created a new kind of superpower, one that is deeply nationalistic and fiercely protective of its sovereignty. In China today, the century of humiliation is taught in every school and featured in every museum. It is the narrative that binds the people to the state. The message is simple. Without a strong central government and a powerful military, China will be carved up again. This history explains why China is so sensitive to Western criticism on human rights or trade. To many in China, it feels like the same old barbarians trying to lecture them and keep them down. This isn't just propaganda. It's a deeply felt cultural trauma. The dragon doesn't just want to participate in the international system. It wants to reshape that system to ensure it can never be humiliated again. From the wolf warrior diplomacy to the massive naval buildup, every action is a brick in a wall designed to keep the world at a respectful distance. The revenge of the dragon is the realization of a century-old dream to turn weakness into strength and debt into dominance. As we look at the world today, it is clear that the cycle has come full circle. The very nations that once dictated terms to a die-in, Qing dynasty, now find themselves economically dependent on a thriving peopleless republic. The silver that once flowed out of China to pay for opium now flows back in through trade surpluses and massive investments. China has rebuilt itself from the ashes of a poisoned empire into a titan that defines the 21st century. The story of China is a reminder that national spirit, when fueled by a history of injustice, can move mountains and build cities where there was once only dust. Whether the world is ready for it or not, the dragon has reclaimed its throne. The century of humiliation is over, and the era of Chinese influence has only just begun. It is a story of resilience, a story of pain, and ultimately, a story of a nation that refused to stay on its knees. The dragon remembers everything, and it is finally, decisively, back.